Before sunrise in the Caribbean, U.S. forces boarded another oil tanker. No warning shot, no press conference, just steel boots on steel decks. The ship was called Olina, and it became the fifth vessel linked to Venezuela seized by the United States in just a few weeks. I want you to pause on that number. 5 ships, different oceans, the same message. This is no longer just about sanctions on paper. This is about control, physical, enforced, unapologetic. The White House calls these ships a ghost fleet. Vessels that change names, flags, identities, trying to outrun American power. And yet, at the very same moment these tankers are being seized, President Trump is preparing to meet U.S. oil executives to discuss investing in Venezuela's oil infrastructure. That contrast matters. If you want to understand where global energy, power, and sovereignty are heading, stay with me. Because this story is not really about one ship. It's about what happens when economic pressure turns into something far more direct. And to understand that, we need to step back and ask a deeper question. What exactly is the United States trying to control here? Let's be clear about the question at the center of this moment. This is not simply about enforcing sanctions. It is about who controls Venezuelan oil and how. In recent weeks, the United States has not just tracked tankers, it has boarded them, seized them, escorted them to U.S. ports. At the same time, President Trump has publicly said Venezuela will turn over between 30 and 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil to the United States. His energy secretary has gone further, saying Washington would control the sale of Venezuelan oil indefinitely, even as the details remain vague. This creates a striking contradiction. On one hand, military force at sea. On the other, closed-door meetings with oil executives about investing in Venezuela's energy infrastructure. Pressure and profit. Enforcement and opportunity. Together, they point to something larger than a sanctions dispute. They suggest a strategy in motion, one that blends economic leverage with physical power. But this strategy didn't appear overnight. To understand why it looks like this today, we need to look at where it began. To see how we arrived here, you have to understand the mechanics of pressure over time. Sanctions are meant to be invisible. They operate through paperwork, banks, insurers, shipping registries. Their power comes from denial, not force. But when oil keeps moving, sanctions adapt. That is where the idea of the ghost fleet enters this story. Tankers that change names, change flags, disappear from tracking systems, and reappear elsewhere, carrying the same sanctioned oil. The Bella one is a perfect example, tracked by the U.S. Coast Guard since December. Renamed Marinera, re-registered under a Russian flag, still moving. From Washington's perspective, this is not just evasion, it is defiance. And so the logic shifts. If sanctions can't stop the flow, enforcement moves closer to the oil itself. From contracts to coast guards, from regulation to interception. What we are witnessing is a transition from economic containment to physical control. And once that line is crossed, every seizure becomes more than routine. Because sooner or later, one moment turns into a test. And that first test has already arrived. Just before dawn on Friday, that test became real. U.S. forces boarded the Olina in the Caribbean. The Coast Guard, Marines from Joint Task Force Southern Spear. The vessel was apprehended, the military said suspected of carrying embargoed Venezuelan oil while trying to evade U.S. forces. This was not a warning, it was an operation. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem called the Olina part of a ghost fleet, a ship without a stable identity, without protection, without a place to hide, and this was not an isolated act. It was the 5th seizure in recent weeks. Another followed the capture of the Bella 1 Inch, the North Atlantic. Another came with the Sophia in international waters near the Caribbean. Each boarding sends the same signal. The ocean is no longer neutral ground. If this analysis helps you see the pattern more clearly, take a moment to stay engaged, because what's unfolding here is bigger than any single ship. The Olina matters not for what it carried, but for what it represents. A line crossed, a precedent set, and once that happens, the real question shifts. What system is being enforced and who designed it? What is being enforced here is not just a sanctions regime. It is a system of control built around oil, logistics, and power. At the center of that system is a simple reality. Oil only matters if it moves, and movement depends on ships, flags, insurance, ports, and protection. The so-called ghost fleet exists in the gaps of that system. Tankers that change names, that switch national registration, that operate in international waters, where jurisdiction becomes blurry. From Washington's perspective, this creates a problem. Sanctions restrict transactions, but they do not physically stop a ship. So the mechanism adapts. Tracking replaces paperwork, boarding replaces blacklists, seizure replaces fines. When the US Coast Guard tracks a vessel for weeks, as it did with the Bella one, that is not surveillance for symbolism. It is preparation. And when Energy Secretary Chris Wright says the United States would control the sale of Venezuelan oil indefinitely, the vagueness is revealing. This is not a defined policy. It is leverage kept deliberately open-ended, control without a timetable, enforcement without a clear exit. That is how systems harden. And once they do, pressure doesn't fade. It escalates. Which brings us to the next moment when this strategy collides with real geopolitical risk. The escalation did not stop with Venezuela. Days after the Olina US forces seized the Bella 1-inch, the North Atlantic, a tanker flying a Russian flag, a vessel that had already changed its name, already shifted identities, already been tracked for weeks. 2 Russian nationals were aboard when it was taken. They were later released after direct authorization from President Trump, and the Kremlin publicly thanked him. That detail matters, because this is where enforcement meets geopolitics. What begins as sanctions enforcement now touches a nuclear power. What looks like maritime policing becomes diplomatic negotiation. The seizure of the Bella One sends a sharper signal than any before it. This strategy is not confined to one country. It is not limited to one region. It follows the oil. Each interception raises the stakes, not just for ship owners or traders, but for states watching closely. The margin for error narrows. A miscalculation at sea, a disputed boarding, a flag taken too literally. This is the second crisis point, not explosive, but brittle. And when systems become brittle, the consequences are felt far beyond the ships themselves. Because the next impact is not on governments. It is on people like you. Up to this point, this story may sound abstract. Ships, flags, sanctions, diplomacy, but this is where it reaches you. When the United States seizes oil tankers and asserts control over Venezuelan crude, the effects ripple outward. Oil markets tighten, supply chains react, prices respond sometimes before anyone explains why. You feel it quietly. At the pump, on your electricity bill, in the cost of transporting food and goods. And for people inside Venezuela, the impact is heavier. Oil is not just a commodity. It is the backbone of the economy. When control shifts offshore, ordinary citizens feel the pressure long before elites do. This is the paradox of power politics. Decisions made in secure rooms or on open seas eventually land on kitchen tables. If you're still with me, stay engaged, because understanding this dynamic is the first step to seeing how global power actually touches daily life. And this is not where the consequences end, because once oil flows are disrupted, the shock does not stay local. It travels. The effects don't stop at national borders. They spread across the global system. When the United States begins seizing tankers in international waters, every energy exporting country takes note. So do shipping companies. So do insurers. So do governments that depend on stable oil flows. This is how uncertainty travels. Not through headlines, but through hesitation. Ships reroute, contracts are rewritten, risk premiums rise quietly, and global energy markets absorb the tension. Russia's involvement, even indirectly, amplifies that signal. A Russian-flagged tanker seized, Russian nationals detained, then released. A public thank you from the Kremlin. This is not escalation, but it is friction. And friction in energy markets has consequences far beyond Venezuela. What Washington is demonstrating is reach, the ability to project enforcement across oceans, to redefine what sanctions look like in practice. For allies, this may feel like reassurance. For others, it looks like precedent. Because once one country normalizes physical control over sanctioned resources, others will ask a simple question: who decides next? And that question leads us straight into the future, where this path can branch in very different ways. Looking ahead, there are three paths this strategy could take. The first is the optimistic one. Control stabilizes the system. Seized oil is managed. Markets adapt. The pressure forces negotiated outcomes, and enforcement becomes predictable rather than explosive. Power is exercised but contained. The second path is murkier. Seizures continue. Rules remain vague. Control exists without clarity. Energy markets live with permanent uncertainty, never collapsing, never settling. A world where enforcement is expected but never fully explained. And then there is the third path, the dangerous one. A disputed boarding, a confrontation at sea, a misread signal between states. When enforcement hardens into confrontation, oil becomes not just an economic asset but a trigger. History tells us something uncomfortable. Systems built on open-ended control rarely de-escalate on their own. They require restraint, structure, and limits. What we are watching now is not just a policy choice. It is a test of whether power can be exercised without becoming a habit. And that brings us to the final question. What should we take away from all of this? This is the moment to step back. What the seizure of the Olena and the other tankers reveals is not a single decision, but a shift in how power is used. Sanctions are no longer just rules written on paper. They are actions enforced at sea. The United States is signaling that control over oil flows matters as much as ownership, that logistics can be leveraged as power, and that enforcement does not need to wait for consensus. This approach may succeed, it may stabilize markets, it may extract concessions, or it may normalize something more troubling, a world where economic disputes are settled by interception, where ambiguity becomes a tool, where precedent quietly replaces principle. If this analysis helped you see the system more clearly, stay with this channel. Share it with someone who wants to understand how global power actually works. Because this story doesn't end here. Every seizure sets the stage for the next response. Every response reshapes the rules. And in a world this interconnected, none of us are just spectators anymore.